So today I want to finish up our discussion of language endangerment by talking about language revitalization. In case you missed last time, we talked about the scope of the problem. Why do we even talk about language endangerment in the first place? Well, it's a really important problem for linguists. This is what we as linguists do, is study human languages, study populations. And when we lose languages, that's as if astronomers all of a sudden one day announced that all the stars were going to burn out. This is literally what we study, and it's disappearing from before our eyes. However, it's not just our problem as linguists. I'm actually kind of selfish that I put it that way. It's really a problem for indigenous people throughout the world. Indigenous people throughout the world are losing their language. And language and identity, as we sort of talked about in the sociolinguistics section, are so inextricably connected. And a loss of language really is a loss of knowledge. People encode all sorts of information in their languages. And when we lose that language, we lose not just the words of the language, but we lose other ways of knowing the world and other ways of being in the world. That's something that indigenous people really feel quite strongly. It's worth thinking about why we document these languages, who we document them for. And the sort of older traditional model of language documentation was extractive. Right? You'd go into a community, you'd work on the community, and then you'd take the language away, put it in a library somewhere, in an archive that you had to be a part of the university to actually see. So the communities themselves didn't often have very much of this information. It was extractive. In the newer model, the way people try to do language documentation now is that we work with communities. We work for communities to try to achieve communities' goals. And we'll talk a little bit about how we do that today. We also talked about how to measure the vitality of a language. It's not just raw speaker count. It's how do speakers feel about their own language? Where are you allowed to use the language? Where are you not allowed to use the language? Is there actually policy against the language being put out? What proportion of speakers are there among the total population of all speakers? But we want to think past kind of just endangerment and think about bringing them back, like I hinted at last time. Documenting a language is this huge undertaking. There's always more to do, so you can't just wait until the language has been documented and then start bringing it back. The two things have to go simultaneously. They have to go hand in hand. Language use. How do we use the language in all these other domains? How do we give instructions to people in the language? I was working on a language endangerment project with speakers, and we were trying to get all sorts of different genres of speech recorded, including instructions, and that was something we didn't understand would be culturally sensitive. So language revitalization has to really inform language documentation from the get-go. What kind of information are indigenous people, are these community members going to want, and how can we provide it to them? It is worth spending a little time thinking about just how vast language really is. Some of my favorite examples are from Algonquian language grammars. This is an exploration of just a small section of the phonology chapter, one of the phonology chapters of the Miami, Illinois grammar by David Costa. And you can see it involves historical linguistics, synchronic linguistics, and everything in between. This is an example of another one of my favorite Algonquian grammars, the Nishnah-Bemwin reference grammar by Rand Valentine. And this is a piece of chapter 17 on some of the morphological and syntactic elements of the language. There is so much to study in language. Each of these books here was the product of more than a decade of work, and there's more decades of that to come. So it can't just wait. The problem has to start being solved now. So how do we do that? When we talk about language revitalization, we're talking about a group of us who are dedicated to reversing language endangerment, to reversing language extinction. We're talking about something that's related to documentary linguistics, like we were talking about last time, but is distinct from it. Language documentation is all about creating those materials, thinking about those materials, who are they for. That's the data that forms the foundation, right? That data forms the foundation of everything we're doing. Language revitalization is about the communities. How can we take this stuff and give it to the communities? The linguist Wes Leonard, on the other hand, has argued against the sort of term language revitalization. He kind of argues this that there's this ideology of sort of essentialism that underlies calling a language revitalization movement that. So he argues in favor of what he calls language reclamation, the idea of taking back areas, domains for the language. That's the sort of idea we'll explore a little bit today, too. Because it's all the same basic question, right? How do you revitalize a language? Obviously, some level of just teaching it is going to be involved. Another method that we'll talk about is called immersion. We'll also talk about something called the master-apprentice method. We'll talk briefly about the role of technology in changing the culture and around language documentation and revitalization. And we'll end with 2 case studies. First, let's talk a little bit again about the transmission. This is such an important piece. We can think about this first generation where language contact and language shift is happening. They are fluent speakers of L1, whatever that language is that we're talking about. Their kids, on the other hand, speak a little bit of the second language, the contact language, the colonial language that's being introduced to this community. Oftentimes, this generation will be doing a little translation for the parents when they go and do things, go into town, get goods. The generation after them is fluent in both languages, both the first language of the community and the second contact language. However, their kids tends to be the case will be fluent speakers of the second language and only rememberers or partially fluent speakers of their community's heritage language. And that's how it happens. Kids who couldn't talk to their great-grandparents if they were around. And it really can happen in the course of a few generations. That's a century's time. And how do we prevent that from happening? Well, how do languages live? They pass from generation to generation. So, reclaiming a language involves picking that chain of transmission back up. We can create places, whether those are actual physical spaces or cultural social institutions that use the language, that encourage the language. And we can also just fully immerse the younger generation in this language to the extent possible so that they can pick it up naturally. How do you ever become a fluent speaker of any other language? Well, one way to do it is to just create places to be surrounded by the language. If you were speaking a major world language, this would be a different story, but for an indigenous language, it often really does involve creating these places, creating an opportunity to speak the language. A really good example of that is an immersion school like Wôpanâak.
We knew that the number of existing elders who spoke Ojibwe fluently, who were raised with Ojibwe as a first language, were vastly diminishing. So we knew we had to do something quick, and so that's why we started Wôpanâak.
In these places, we call this an immersion context because we try to maximize the target language and minimize every other language. There might be some direct instruction where we say, hey, this is how we do this is how we do that. But even that we would try to do entirely in the language that we're talking about. This is another example of an immersion context. This is an immersion camp more than an immersion school like we just saw, but we see people explaining the language in the language to learners who are taking notes and listening attentively. Speaking of direct instruction, teaching them is going to be a central part of any strategy for language revitalization as it's typically understood. This has its pros as well. It's very amenable to the output of linguistic research, right? If I create a paper or an article or a grammar for linguists, I can also take a version of that and recreate it for another audience like language teachers. And there's also a ton of research to draw on from language revitalization, from language education. So there's these interesting methods you can use that people will talk about that we won't talk too much about here today. However, this is not as easy to do if a major world language comes your way. You can just Google whatever you need. If you want to learn Chinese, you can set your Windows interface to Chinese. If you want to learn Spanish, you can Google all the Spanish you would ever could dream of. But in an indigenous language, you have to create a lot of that stuff. And the classes that you would get, even for those major world languages, probably not going to make you become a fluent speaker. They will make you have a lot of experience with the language, but probably not a fluent speaker. If that's your goal, that's probably not the right way to do it. Or at least it can't be your only tool in the toolkit. Even if you do have those classes, it's way harder to train or find a good teacher in an indigenous language context. It's hard to get them the correct state certifications in a place like America where there are very strict rules about who can be in a classroom. Sometimes speakers are too old, or they've been subconsciously sort of trained not to speak the language for long periods of time or to explain it in English. That's why there was a method invented in the California language context called the Master Apprentice method. The Master Apprentice program is basically one-on-one language immersion. It involves a fluent speaker who is the master or the mentor, often this person is an elder, and then a trainee or the apprentice learner who is going to spend just absolutely as much time as they can with this speaker. That could be at a minimum of 10 to 20 hours a week work just on language, or it could be a long-term partnership that involves them living together. Oftentimes these might be family members, distant, sometimes family members, or people from related tribes, and you learn the language through performing the actions of daily life. Getting up, making tea, doing all of that stuff in the language. This has a lot of benefits. It's often considered to be a very healing and kind of reconnecting process, since the idea is to recreate that interrupted transmission. A Master Apprentice program really does recreate a transmission from an elder to a younger person, the apprentice typically much younger. I've been witness to several of these programs, many of which were very successful. There's some excellent speakers of Potawatomi I know who were created from the Pokagon Band's language apprenticeship program. However, these can be difficult and maybe expensive to implement, depending on exactly the setup of the tribe of the language that you're talking about. In that sense, technology has really played a huge role. We've talked about this a little bit already. Recording technology has played a huge role in the advancement of language documentation, but also language revitalization. Linguists and communities want more material more often. Many communities do have access to the internet, access to smartphones, access to apps, access to the sort of latest tricks that we're taking advantage of right now. Even communities that might surprise you and places that might surprise you have relatively reliable access to technology sometimes, but not everywhere and not everyone and not all the time, so there need to be old-fashioned solutions as well, of course. However, there's certainly a wealth right now of language apps and tools that can be used to help you learn languages, even endangered languages. If you are a person who's interested in programming and computers, I would definitely take this moment to beg you to work in linguistics. There are a bunch of us who want help from programmers. There are some great examples of apps that are created from government funding sources. For instance, some wonderful apps created by British Columbia's language revitalization efforts. But also private companies do have some limited options for language endangerment, language revitalization options. There are also some incredible examples of this from the Navajo tribe. The first case study, though, that we'll talk about doesn't take technology at its core. It's a low-tech solution to restoring and recreating the interrupted transmission. The Maori language is a Polynesian language. It's related closely to languages like Hawaiian, Tahitian, other Polynesian languages. It's spoken in New Zealand and has a familiar story. In the 1800s, New Zealand, it was a widely spoken language. There was only very limited English spoken in New Zealand at that time. But 2 centuries later, less than 20% of people could still speak Maori, even among their own people. So the solution for them in fixing the intergenerational transmission problem was what they called language nests. These language nests were basically preschool, wraparound care, after school care, daily activities entirely in the Maori language, teaching Maori kids how to be Maori. The case of Maori has really been a success story that's hard to duplicate. So what does it mean when a language loses its last speaker and becomes dormant? Any human language is learnable by any human. We take great pains at the beginning of the semester to drill that into your heads. That means that any language that passes into a sleeping phase can be brought back if there's sufficient documentation. And oftentimes, there is sufficient documentation. In the case of Wôpanâak, a language that has unfortunately been in the news recently, a language reclamation project has resulted in huge numbers of second language speakers where for a very long time there were none. Wôpanâak is an Algonquian language. It's a polysynthetic language, so it's morphologically complex and very interesting from my perspective. And it again has a familiar story through the process of religious conversion, cultural change, government laws against the use of Wôpanâak, making Wôpanâak illegal. But there was a wealth of documentation in the language, texts, stories, letters to and from native speakers of the language. So we had a really good insight into what speakers thought and what speakers said. There were no speakers of Wôpanâak for 150 years, that is, until Jessie Littledoe-Baird came around. Jessie Littledoe-Baird is a MacArthur Genius Fellow, and she had a dream one night of her ancestors speaking to her in the language that inspired her to study linguistics and learn Wôpanâak from scratch.
There's a prophecy for our people that said that there was a time when language went away, and there would be a time when language would come back to the people if they wanted to welcome it back. And we feel like this is our time. And it's about the people.
Since that time, there's been an immersion school. There are before and after school programs. There are books. There are people growing up to speak the language for the first time in more than 150 years.